Thanks to Jane and everybody at NYU for making this event and my visit possible. I used to be able to say that the difference between me and Geoffrey Harpham was that he had a white beard, but then over the years that's become a difference without a distinction. My subject today is the humanities. It's widely thought to be a very dull subject or even a non-subject. It's a subject that most humanists themselves hardly think about. In fact, they don't think of themselves as humanists. They think of themselves as specialists in one subfield or another. The humanities might be compared to North America, which is a kind of notional entity that doesn't have either the visceral grip of the US of A or La France Profonde or this sceptered isle, or the oceanic satisfaction of the earth or the family of man. We have very fond but vague thoughts about North America, and I think it's just this way with the humanities. We think of it, when we think about it at all, as a very ancient thing, a very large thing. It goes all the way back to the beginnings of culture. It goes all the way around the world. It goes all the way up to the heights of poetry and metaphysics. It's a very large and a very fine thing, but it's just there. Nothing interesting can be said about it. And I'm going to argue that it is in fact a very fine thing. It's perhaps a finer thing than many of us recognize. But it's not just there. It was put there by certain people for a reason. I'm going to argue that the humanities are an American invention whose entire span lies within the time of my life, not directly related to that. During that time, they become encased or even immured in a distinctive rhetoric that seems entirely content to occupy the uninspired terrain between the vaguely edifying and the altogether banal. I'm going to force you to focus on some of that rhetoric and to contemplate its implications. But my emphasis here will be primarily historical. The story of how that palaver came to be is a lot more interesting than the palaver itself, and I'm going to argue that we do ourselves a huge favor by learning that story. Now, I'm treating as prehistory classical philosophy, medieval scholasticism, Renaissance humanism, Cambridge Platonism, the Enlightenment, the Literae Humaniores at Oxford, and the new humanism of the early 20th century, indeed everything else. I had lunch with Richard Sennett this afternoon, and he said, "What's your title?" And I said, "Oh, it's How America Invented the Humanities." And he said, "Well, you lost all the Catholics right there." And I think that in that brutal delimitation of the subject, I may have lost a lot of people, but stick with me on that. One of the main tributaries, in my account, was the thinking of John Adams, whose famous fantasy expressed in a 1780 letter to his wife, in which he saw his lineage evolving from warriors into dilettantes, has come to seem, I think, like a bad historical joke played by the past on the present. We're still studying politics and war, but we haven't gotten any better at them. Still, this vision, which Adams then wrote into the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, the same year, is the germ of the modern humanities. It's well worth recalling that once upon a time, the ruling class, which had also been the revolutionary class, imagined that they were risking their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on behalf of a futurity where what would come to be called the humanities would dominate the concerns of the citizenry. The humanities, they thought, would represent the crowning achievement of a nation that, having prevailed in war, would construct its new society on a foundation of such economic and military and social security that citizens could enrich their experience by turning their attention to the study of textual and material artifacts. Adams and Jefferson and others thought that this represented the best possible future for the new nation, as well as the natural tendency or progression of mankind if they had been freed from the burdens of fear and want. This belief that the unique circumstances of the nation gave its citizens privileged access to the fullness of the human condition determined the development of liberal education in this country, and once upon a time had the effect of placing the humanities at the very center of American self-understanding. Now, the traumas of the first half of the 20th century didn't bring this vision any closer to realization, but they perhaps did make it even more compelling as a distant goal. The vision had already been advanced piecemeal by educational reformers such as Bronson Alcott and Horace Mann and John Dewey, and by such well-publicized successes as the Great Books program in Chicago and the core curriculum at Columbia, and the program in the humanities at Princeton, founded in 1930. It was the very first one. And so as the Second World War drew to a close, the time finally seemed right for Adams's grandchildren. The Declaration of Independence of the Humanities was the Harvard Red Book of 1945, whose official title was General Education in a Free Society. You can see why it was called the Red Book. It was produced by a committee of eminent Harvard professors convened in the spring of 1943 by President James Bryan Conant. The group worked for 2 years as the war was being waged and won, and they published their report as it ended. It's a wartime document. The Red Book is concerned with such issues as why we fight, and was written in full awareness of the fact that the educational system would soon be inundated by hundreds and thousands of GIs who would be returning home and expecting the education that had been guaranteed them by the GI Bill of 1944. So the challenge was to create a system that would make available to vastly expanded numbers of students the educational advantages that had hitherto been available only to a few. In his charge to the committee, Conant said, "The primary concern of American education today is not the development of the appreciation of the good life in young gentlemen born to the purple. It is the infusion of the liberal and humane tradition into our entire educational system." And they were talking about high school as well as college. "Our purpose is to cultivate in the largest possible number of our future citizens an appreciation of both the responsibilities and the benefits which come to them because they are American and are free." By the time these words appeared in print, the war was won, and the Red Book announcing the great mission of American education became a national symbol of renewal. I was born about a year after that. So what does the Red Book say? It says, to begin with, that education serves the interests of the nation, and it does so by calling out and fortifying those attributes of people and societies that are most conducive to political and economic and ideological success. These attributes are not American inventions, nor do they serve America directly or exclusively. They're rather human attributes that are associated in the popular mind, at least most habitually, with the great age of Athenian democracy, and then refined by the centuries in the Western tradition, of which the United States was in this moment claiming to be the leading contemporary representative. The pertinence of the classical tradition to contemporary American circumstances is established immediately with two epigraphs at the beginning of the book. The first is from Thucydides, a passage in which Pericles states plainly the position of an exultant new superpower eagerly awaiting a global expansion of its ambitions. "We need no Homer," he says, "to praise us. Rather, we have opened the whole earth and sea to our enterprise and raised everywhere living memorials to our fortune." In the second epigraph from the Republic, youth is described as the time when character is being molded and easily takes any impress one may wish to stamp on it. Taken together, the two suggest that the goal of education is the formation of a citizenry fitted to the task of ruling the world. As we used to know, ruling requires coherence and discipline, which the Red Book sought to foster by providing a core curriculum, knowledge that was thought to be essential for all students to know. The committee noted that at Harvard there were very few requirements beyond the major, and students were both getting lost in a maze of electives and ultimately gravitating towards those courses that would do them most professional or vocational good. What the committee sought was an education that would represent a common discipline, a common view of life. In itself, the principle of unity in the curriculum was not an innovation. In fact, before there were electives, it was all unity. It was the electives that had created this unity. One thing that was new was the Red Book's explicitness about the geopolitical rationale of that unity. The committee designed a core intended to manifest the character of the American society and embody certain intangibles of the American spirit. Anchored by such a curriculum, educated would be dedicated to the making of Americans, in large part through the inculcation of what it called heritage. The Red Book concludes emphatically, in general education, the greatest incentive comes from the whole man's awareness of his share in the common fate of his part in the joint undertaking. Now this phrase, the whole man, signals another of the Red Book's innovations, the normative vision of humanity that education is supposed to serve. The authors devote a lot of attention to the whole man, whose development, they say, is the entire aim of liberal education. Such a man, forged, it seems, in the underground foundries of the Rotary Club, possesses poise and firmness, but also enjoys a rich, emotional, spiritual, even instinctual life. Whole men are reflective, curious, and appreciative of art, but they're also gregarious and at home in the world. They are committed to intelligent and principled action and are full-blooded human beings as well as trained minds. It sounds very good. They differ from the partial men, which is to say the pliant and morally amputated men of the totalitarian states against which we had just waged war, by being fully realized and morally sound individuals as well as loyal citizens of the nation. Again and again, the Red Book stresses that the American heritage honors equally the dignity and freedom of the individual and the needs of the common weal. Democracy, it says, is a community of free men. That is, a group that is united by the common possession of individual freedom. The whole man is at once characteristically American and optimally human, combining its understandings of the national interest, the national heritage, and the national character. The Red Book declares in language that echoes Adams's Massachusetts Constitution and continues to reverberate, as we will see, to the present day, that the aim of education is mastery of life, and since living is an art, wisdom is the indispensable means to this end. Now, it's in the context of this new post-war national self-understanding that the humanities emerge as the central component of general education. It's in the humanities classroom, not the math, science, or the social science classroom, that students are inspired, that the emotions as well as the intellect are engaged, that abstract values are shown being tested in action, and that students get instructive images of mastery and wisdom. And within the humanities, this gladdens my heart, it is English that invariably sets the tone as the central humanistic study, offering peculiar opportunities for the realization of the goals of general education. Now, considering the very elevated and generalizing tone of the Red Book, the section on English has a striking particularity. In fact, it presents an account of literature and literary studies that was edgy even in its time. This section, like the references to the whole man and the art of living, betrays the undoubted influence of I.A. Richards, the British literary critic who had been a pioneer in the new field of English literature at Cambridge. He's the author of Principles of Literary Criticism and, most importantly, Practical Criticism. Richards had come to Harvard in 1944 at the express invitation of President Conant, just to serve on this committee. He stayed, of course, for many years thereafter. Unlike his fellow committee members, who were distinguished Harvard professors, mostly with administrative positions, he was an iconoclast and a polemicist. Before he arrived at Harvard, his work in criticism, which emphasized a discipline of close reading that focused on the linguistic and formal features of the text to the exclusion of extra-textual sources, stuff like biography and history, had exerted a profound influence on several young men who subsequently became important critics, including F.R. Leavis and William Empson. Once in America, Richards continued to be a compelling voice, influencing the new criticism whose practitioners included John Crowe Ransom, W.K. Wimson, and Cleant Brooks. Now, I'm thinking that Richards must have been a brilliantly effective presence on the committee, because the treatment of English, which is the core of the humanistic core of the core curriculum, so perfectly contradicts the rest of the Red Book that it seems that he composed this subject without either opposition or resistance. It's written like no other section of the book. It specifies an orthodoxy, beginning with a list of prevailing trends that are to be firmly discouraged. Stress on factual content, divorced from design. Emphasis on literary history, generalizations as to periods in place of deeper familiarity. Strained correlation with civics and social studies. Didacticism, lessons in behavior too closely sought. I think if Martha Nussbaum had been writing at that time, he would have singled her out in particular as a tendency to be deplored. Approved trends are specified with equal detail. The ethical results of literature are not to be seen as obedience to a body of precepts, but come in quickened imagination, heightened delight, and clearer perspective. And finally, there's a list of things to be stressed, including intensive study of well-written paragraphs and poems, the normal ingredients of full meaning, the literal sense, metaphoric implications, and finally, the utility, almost the necessity of metaphor. Now, this is presented as the consensus on the art and science of teaching English, a middle-of-the-road policy, unquote. But these lists constitute, in fact, a very compressed version of the program that the ambitious and determined Richards had been pushing with various success in England for 20 years. And in its exclusion from consideration that anything outside the text, the program, of course, utterly negates the emphasis on heritage, much less on a particular national heritage that the Red Book otherwise insists on. Now, the committee may have been willing to tolerate this striking deviation from its message because it found congenial the overall individualism and moralism of Richards' approach. They might also have liked his emphasis on charismatic teaching, which had been a New England tradition since Jonathan Edwards. to Richards, who early in his career, I find this infinitely amusing, had to collect fees from students directly when they entered the classroom because the university would not support the discipline of English. A certain kind of teaching was a professional necessity, and he built into the Red Book an impassioned evocation of the power of the charismatic pedagogue. The best way to infect the student with the zest for intellectual integrity is to put him near a teacher who is himself selflessly devoted to the truth, so that a spark from the teacher will, so to speak, leap across the desk into the classroom, kindling within the student the flame of intellectual integrity, which will thereafter sustain itself. It's an account of the classroom, actually, that many of Richards' own students might well associate with him. Now, some might find it curious that a book so explicitly devoted to manifesting the American spirit should include at its center such a prescriptive passage written by an Englishman with his own agenda. Others might find interesting the complete disappearance of history from the core discipline of a curriculum that was ostensibly devoted to heritage. Still others might wonder how electrifying and inflammatory classroom experiences could transmit a common tradition or a common view of life. But maybe the most incongruous fact about the Red Book is that most of its recommendations were immediately rejected by the Harvard faculty, including the idea of requiring a course on the humanities, the course Richards himself was teaching, Humanities 1A, Sources of Our Common Thought, Homer, the Old Testament, and Plato. But incoherent and rejected as it was, the Red Book immediately became national policy in the form of a 6-volume report from President Truman's Commission on Higher Education, which was convened the following year. The Truman Report, called Higher Education for American Democracy, repeats without significant alteration the analysis and many of the recommendations formulated at Harvard, including the need for a core of unity achieved through general education. The report deplores specialization and instrumentalization in terms that would have been wholly endorsed by Conant's committee, and it reiterates the idea of wholeness. Too often, it says, the graduate is educated in that he has acquired competence in some particular occupation, yet falls short of that human wholeness and civic conscience which the cooperative activities of citizenship require. To counteract this tendency, the report proposes a unified general education for American youth, one that would involve the transmission of a common cultural heritage toward a common citizenship and a free society. Education, the report says, is not an end to itself, but a means to a more abundant life, a means to a more abundant personal life and a freer, stronger social order. In each phrase, the Commission relays the message of the Red Book and translates it into national policy. Now, the Truman Report, in all its 6 volumes, does not pay a lot of attention to the humanities, but it does establish the sign under which all subsequent discussion of the humanities was to proceed, reflecting on the dangerous post-war world, dangers that had not been to Conant's committee. The Commission describes the present as, in the title of one section, a time of crisis. Now, this crisis, in which the security of the nation depended in part on the effectiveness of the educational system, was, at this time, 1947, situated in the world at large. It was a worldwide crisis of mankind. But just a few years later, the crisis would become associated with the humanities themselves. In 1964, the first of what would eventually be dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of publications with the title Crisis in the Humanities appeared, a collection of dyspeptic essays edited by the historian J.H. Plum that complained about fragmentation and jargon and a drifting sense of purposelessness. Oddly, at the same moment, a new document appeared, the Report of the Commission on the Humanities, sponsored primarily by the American Council of Learned Societies. This document led directly to the creation the following year, 1965, of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. At the very moment that the humanities were said to be in complete disarray, the federal government was determining that the national interest required a new federal agency dedicated to their support. Now, somehow, the distinguished 20-member commission that produced this report, which included a number of active scholars, had not heard of any crisis in the humanities. But in the context of the Soviet launch of Sputnik and the fear of a missile gap between the United States and a crescent Soviet Union, and in the immediate aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, they were, however, highly aware of a more general crisis in which the humanities might, they thought, play a useful role if only it didn't have its own crisis to contend with. The state of the humanities today creates a crisis for national leadership, not because the humanities had fallen into disrepute, but because they were scandalously underfunded by comparison to science. And so in order to move the Congress to action, the Commission voiced its concerns in the most oracular terms possible, defining the humanities as nothing less than the conservator of human being. The humanities are the study of what is most human. One cannot speak of history or culture apart from the humanities. They not only record our lives are the very substance they are made of. Their subject is every man. Notice how relentlessly patriarchal this is at this point. We propose, therefore, a program for all our people, a program to meet a need no less serious than that for national defense. We speak in truth for what is being defended, our beliefs, our ideals, our highest achievements. I want you to note how in a few effortless and even seemingly contentless sentences, this passage knots together what is most human, American ideals, and national defense. Even more explicitly than the Red Book, the ACLS report identifies the American, both American national character and American political interests, with the optimally human, and it preserves the Red Book's emphasis on wisdom, a term it invokes with a glancing reference to Matthew Arnold in the context of what has become a darkly threatening world. Democracy demands wisdom of the average man. Without the exercise of wisdom, free institutions and personal liberty are inevitably imperiled. To know the best that has been thought and said in former times can make us wiser than we otherwise might be, and in this respect, the humanities are not merely our, but the world's best hope. The source of and inspiration for these passages is clearly the Red Book, but the sense of imminent danger here indicates the changed situation. No longer are we in the spacious, confident moment immediately following World War II, but the darker, more anxious time of the Cold War. Interestingly, the concept of the humanities is said to be as pertinent to the new context as it had been to the old. But even in the context of the Cold War, there's another aspect of the humanities that struggles to declare itself in this Commission report. World leadership of the kind which has come upon the United States cannot rest solely upon superior force, vast wealth, or preponderant technology. Only the elevation of its goals and the excellence of its conduct entitle one nation to ask others to follow its lead. These are things of the spirit. If we appear to discourage creativity, to demean the fanciful and the beautiful, to have no concern for man's ultimate destiny, if, in short, we ignore the humanities, then both our goals and our efforts to attain them will be measured with suspicion. A generation after the Red Book, the moralized virility of the whole man has begun to evolve in a new direction toward aestheticism, spirituality, creativity, even while retaining the insistence on the connection between the humanities and American world leadership. The National Endowment for the Humanities was born of this shotgun marriage between national defense and things of the spirit. In 1965, through an act of Congress that borrowed much of its language from the ACLS report of 1964, which is no surprise since both texts were written primarily by the same man, ACLS President Robert Lumiansky. Lumiansky made every effort to preserve the spirit of the Red Book in the act of Congress, but the tectonic shifts in the world since 1945 demanded a number of rhetorical adjustments. I want you to compare, for example, the Red Book's invocation of wisdom. The aim of education is mastery of life, and since living is an art, wisdom is the indispensable means to this end, with the legislation, a generation later, creating the NEH. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. Now, in the second passage, we still need wisdom, but wisdom is now demanded of citizens who, if the demand is not met, might be plunged into robotic servitude. At a deeper level, people are conceived not as artists of their own lives, but as subjects of the state, that is, as citizens, and with the assistance of the humanities as masters of technology. Under these highly stressed terms, support began to flow from Washington, but the creation of the NEH both ensured federal support for the humanities and exposed them to political pressures. In the mid-1990s, former NEH chairs William Bennett and Lynn Cheney argued before a committee of Congress that humanistic scholars had so lost touch with the rhetoric of ennoblement, virtue, and the verities, had become so indifferent to the burdens of world leadership, so politicized in their scholarship and teaching, that the NEH should be abolished rather than continue to enable them. Their attacks revealed not just how vulnerable the humanities had become, but also they revealed a deep paradox in the American conception of the humanities. Conceived as an expression of the American spirit, the humanities were also predicated on individual self-realization. In other words, they were understood as a state-sponsored form of resistance to statism that would, in a further paradox, redound to the greater glory of the state. When Bennett and Cheney and other conservatives didn't see among the professoriate supported by the state any signs that they recognized, much less endorsed the program, they felt betrayed, even suckered. The NEH has never recovered from their attacks and today has about 1/3 the resources in constant dollars that it had at its peak in the late 1970s. The dwindling budget of the NEH expresses, I think, the nation's disappointment in the humanities for their failure to make us wise, or even to manifest wisdom in themselves. Still, old habits die hard, especially when funding is at stake, and more than 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the NEH continues to state its mission in the terms of 1965, when the humanities represented the nation's high qualities as a leader. This is from the current website. Because democracy demands wisdom, the National Endowment for the Humanities serves and strengthens our republic by promoting excellence in the humanities and conveying the lessons of history to all Americans. And in 2005, the endowment celebrated its 40th birthday by issuing a coffee table book whose title recalled the Cold War, when the nation tied its geopolitical interests to education and scholarship, fearless and free. Now, 1965 may have been the last time when the humanities could plausibly be advanced as the instrument of the national will or the expression of the national character. By the late 1970s, many Americans were experiencing a different kind of crisis, which President Jimmy Carter characterized in a speech delivered in 1979 as a crisis of confidence. In this very famous address, Carter identified two threats to the nation's security. The first was dependence on foreign energy sources, and the second, which acquired the name of malaise, a term that did not actually appear in this speech, was more abstract and deeper, and as Carter said, merely invisible in ordinary ways. This was a crisis afflicting the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The most obvious sign that something had gone awry was the widespread tendency to worship self-indulgence and consumption. But we've discovered, he said, that owning things and consuming things cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. An engineer by training, but very soon to become a humanist, that is, an historian and a novelist, Carter was reaffirming in the throes of a present crisis and in a somewhat more melancholic tone the same analysis of the threats to America's cultural and political health that had informed the discourse of the humanities since the Red Book. Now, Carter's speech provides the immediate context for the last of the official pronouncements that I'm going to be considering here, a 1980 book sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation called The Humanities in American Life. It's the product of a 32-member commission chaired by Richard Lyman, who is president of Stanford. The report begins by announcing its own kind of malaise, a profound disquiet about the state of the humanities in our culture. Like their distinguished predecessors, these distinguished people defer to their distinguished predecessors, invoking wisdom and mastery and heritage. And they simply repeat many of the 1964 ACLS report's terms, including critical judgment, aesthetic appreciation, moral decision-making, and things of the spirit. They repeat, too, the claim that the fate of the nation is bound up with humanistic scholarship. We must, the authors say, stress how limited our sense of national purpose is, indeed how imperiled our civilization is, if the humanities are exiled to a peripheral role of irrelevance. Now, much of the emphasis of this 1980 Rockefeller report falls on the need for increased funding. By 1980, in fact, it seems to have become impossible to think about the humanities without including in your thoughts some bitter reflections on money. But the Rockefeller report is not just a rearrangement of available cliches in the form of a funding proposal. It registers its moment by contributing three new elements to the discourse of the humanities. First, the crisis in the humanities is now positioned not in the world at large, as it was for the Truman Report, and not in the funding of the humanities, as it was in the ACLS report, but in the practice of the humanities disciplines themselves. Scholarship, the report says, has not escaped the general loss of purpose Carter noted. Many would argue that the humanities are in crisis and would describe this crisis as symptomatic of a general weakening of our vision and resolve. Second, while the ACLS report mentions the fanciful and the beautiful, the Rockefeller report dives much further into the sanctuary of the inner life, where it says the humanities also live. At the end of a section on culture and citizenship, the report says, there are other values besides civic ones, and they are often found in privacy, intimacy, and distance from civic life. The humanities sustain this second conception of individuality as deeply rooted as the other in our cultural inheritance. The humanities offer intensely personal insights into the recesses of experience. I was delighted to have what was a speculation confirmed for me a couple of weeks ago. This passage bears the contrarian stamp of Commission member Helen Vendler, the noted scholar and critic of poetry who would in 2005 publish a book called Invisible Listeners, Lyric Intimacy of Herbert Whitman and Ashbery. And while it's consistent with what I already noted as the softening or devirilizing trend of official pronouncements in the ACLS report, it also marks a moment of genuine dissensus on the Commission when the discourse of entirely private reflection and sensibility, an interior zone of secrecy and inner experience untouched by the external world, becomes, if only momentarily, detached from both the bien-pensant post-Red Book discourse of citizenship and virtue and from the increasingly unpersuasive arguments that cast the humanities as the last redoubt of democracy. Put women on the committee, it seems, and the conversation is no longer focused on the moral excellence of whole men. In fact, the 1980 committee had, in addition to Helen Vendler, a powerful cadre, Nan Cohen, an associate professor at Stanford, that's soon to become president of Wellesley and then Duke, Jill Kerr-Conway, president of Smith, and Hannah Gray of the University of Chicago. Now, this perspective of the individual is linked to the third and perhaps most interesting contribution to the discourse of the humanities that is introduced by the Rockefeller Report. I'm talking about private funding for the humanities. Philanthropic support from foundations, corporations, and individuals, the report notes, provides multiple centers of initiative and response and often attaches fewer political and bureaucratic strings to grants. It can allow more freedom for innovative and controversial projects. Now, this recognition, I think, represents an even more decisively American contribution to the concept of the humanities than the rhetoric of national identity and security, because it underscores the perspective not of the state, but of the entrepreneurial individual operating in a free market. One of the most distinctive features of the humanities in this country is the involvement of private individuals who have supported scholarship through philanthropy, often through private foundations such as the Rockefeller. The connection between private philanthropy and scholarship in the humanities has been deep and determining, if not as broad-based as many people might wish. Humanists work in buildings, including libraries, that are named for the individuals who built them. Their salaries, research expenses, conference travel expenses, and sabbatical salaries are drawn at least in part from endowments contributed by individuals. The presses and journals that publish their work may be supported by grants from individuals or foundations, and the very colleges and universities that employ them are of course supported by massive development operations that train their sites on individual donors. It is shocking how imperfectly most American scholars grasp the fact that their work is at every point and at every level supported by private gifts. Even some of those who are fortunate enough to hold endowed shares are oblivious to the perspective or life history of the donor of the gift that pays their salary. So, on the principle that one ought to know one's friends, I'd like now to consider, as an instance of the philanthropic perspective, a recent essay by one of the most generous funders of the humanities in the United States, Richard J. Frankie, formerly chairman of the John Devine Company and the founder of the Chicago Humanities Festival, as well as the Frankie Institute for the Humanities at the University of Chicago, and other things elsewhere. His essay, The Power of the Humanities and a Challenge to Humanists, appeared in the winter 2009 issue of Daedalus, a collection of 12 essays on the humanities that was gathered together by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, Frankie does not think or write like a scholar. His essay is not at home in Daedalus, but he himself is completely at home in the discourse of the humanities that I've been talking about so far, because he shares with that discourse a few basic convictions. That the humanities protect and give life to our most enduring values, that they prepare people for life, especially moral decision-making, they relate to robust and prosperous citizenship, they've suffered neglect over the past few years, the past few decades, and that despite all these quite obvious points, humanists themselves have not succeeded in explaining the value of their work. That value, in Frankie's view, is cashed out after graduation. The primary value of the humanities is their contribution to developing judgment, which is useful in, for example, business. This is why Frankie organized staff seminars at Louvain in which professors led discussions of Saul Bellow or Antigone. The humanities, Frankie says, are vital to public life. They help us to imagine the consequences of our action and give us the tools to make informed policy decisions. Even more, the moral, aesthetic, and spiritual discoveries of the humanities reveal what is common to the human experience and provide the foundation for a successful and fulfilling life. In short, he all but says they make us whole men. It's difficult to imagine a clearer statement. Its lucidity reflects the confidence generated by a long tradition of discourse and also by his own professional success. But in style and substance, you may have noted, it is very different from the ordinary practice of the scholars whose work it purports to describe. Frankie betrays, at least in this little essay, very little interest in the discipline of humanistic scholarship. Indeed, he scarcely mentions the academy except as the place where teaching happens. The entire concept of the humanities is wrapped tightly in a coil of utility which circles around to profits, which he construes in a quite literal way. You can make money with this stuff, he says. I've done so. Now, many scholars who read Frankie's essay undoubtedly felt a sense of acute discomfort, even embarrassment. But why? It can't be because he expresses untrue or unworthy thoughts. Would we rather believe that the humanities make no contribution to successful lives, or that they contribute to unsuccessful lives? I think the reason is actually that Frankie has a completely different orientation to the humanities from that of most scholars. He is decidedly liberal, as in liberal arts, in his approach. His understanding of the humanities is drawn not from professional scholarship, but from a lifetime of amateur enthusiasm. Scholars are not amateurs, you may have noticed. The credentialing process beats it out of them. New graduate students may begin with a love of their subject and a desire to do the world some good, but graduate training has a deliberalizing effect on students. It structures their thinking, it disciplines their mode of expression, and professionalizes their relationship to their fields. A loose comment made by a graduate student to the effect that studying Bellow's Herzog really demonstrates the value of emotional honesty would be too honest altogether, because it would signal professional immaturity. The image that Frankie presents of the humanities is a professional embarrassment to a scholar. It's like a baby picture shown to your grown-up friends. But at this point, I'd like to suggest an irony appears. Philanthropists hold the humanities in great esteem. They understand how money is made. They understand in particular the notion of market share. They value the humanities for their distinctiveness. Above all, they understand that the goal of wise investing is long-term gains. This understanding can lead them to an appreciation of what has been called the usefulness of useless knowledge. Knowledge, that is, that produces no immediate benefit, but that may result in some distant and unpredicted, but more enduring reward. Taking the long view, philanthropists such as Frankie place their bets on the proposition that the humanities represent a particularly useful and worthy and pleasurable form of useless knowledge. Moreover, while many are politically conservative, they support the academy in the full understanding that most professors are not. They are willing to look beyond politics, even if many in the professoriate cannot seem to imagine that there is anything beyond politics. In short, the diminishing number of philanthropists are the idealists, and the increasingly dependent scholars are the cynics. The situation may well call for a rethink. Now, so far, I've focused on two kinds of discourse about the humanities: official statements of committees and commissions, and the discourse of philanthropy. Most scholars regard both as very removed from what they actually do. So I want to close by considering an instance of a scholarly discourse on the humanities, Andrew Delbanco's 1999 book, The Real American Dream, a Meditation on Hope. Now, this is not a book about the humanities, but a kind of uncategorizable combination of history, polemic, sermon, and personal testament. It's a wide-ranging meditation on the nation's fantasy life. But since the humanities are a part of that fantasy life and the part that Delbanco himself inhabits, his book can also be read as an angled account of the humanities in America. This book begins with a discussion not about the ways that Americans have dreamt their dream, but rather with a discussion of the reasons that people dream at all, which is, he says, to escape the gnawing sense that life is pointless and futile. This basic response to existential terror is a species characteristic, but Americans have been particularly assiduous in its cultivation, beginning with the Puritans, who told themselves stories about a vengeful and omnipotent God. Over the course of the 19th century, stories about God were replaced by stories about the nation. And then after the 1960s, these stories were in turn replaced with stories centering on the self. So American history falls into three basic epochs of God, nation, and self, two phases of coherent belief, followed by a third phase of incoherence and nervous waiting, as he puts it. So the real American dream concerns then the stories that Americans tell themselves to counteract their own sense of hopelessness and futility. But the term Delbanco prefers, and the one that hovers over the entire book, is melancholy, whose first theorist in an American context was Alexis de Tocqueville, who identified it as an attribute of democracy itself. In a passage that Delbanco cites, de Tocqueville says that in a democracy, men easily attain a certain equality of condition, but they can never attain as much as they desire. It perpetually requires before them, yet without hiding itself from their sight, and in retiring, draws them on. That is the reason for the strange melancholy that haunts inhabitants of democratic countries in the midst of abundance. Democracy creates fantasies of a state of perfect wholeness and integration, with promises of abundance and enough actual abundance to make people feel that those promises might one day be redeemed. America is in fact the most melancholy of nations. And so, Delbanco says, his meditation on hope will also be a theory of melancholy in its particular American form. Now, Delbanco is particularly melancholic about our current era, which seems to him a time of singular emptiness compared to its predecessors. The Puritan God was horrifying but impressive. The nation, as articulated by figures such as Jefferson, Whitman, Lincoln, and Melville, could be inspiring. But the current phase in Delbanco's account is just pathetic. We slipped into incoherence in the mid-1960s. In fact, he dates it to a certain date in August 1964, just about as the NEH was getting started, when something gave way in American society. The dream of nation collapsed into a daydream of personal gratification, and the notion of a common destiny worth tears and sacrifice was abandoned in favor of a meretricious fantasy of consumption. And there we sit, miserable amid our possessions. The whole abysmal situation brings out the Puritan moralist, or maybe the Jimmy Carter, latent in Delbanco. And what, he cries, does the plenty avail us? Now, at such moments, Delbanco, Harvard PhD, declares his affiliation with the sensibility informing the Red Book and the subsequent discourse of the humanities. This sensibility is organized around a few key concepts, including anti-materialism, a concern for culture and inner enrichment, an aspiration to reach beyond the academy and beyond knowledge itself to wisdom. But perhaps the most tellingly humanistic feature of the real American dream is Delbanco's insistence that we should now abort the brief era of self and move on to the era of world, in which people construct their identities as part of mankind in general. Now, this would seem to be a cosmopolitan fourth phase, but clearly one of the great appeals of world for Delbanco is that it rehabilitates phase two, nation, and expands it. The real American dream, Delbanco says, has always been a global dream. To be really American has always meant to see something beyond America. Delbanco quotes with a palpable thrill the passage from Melville's White Jacket in which the manifest destiny of America is announced. We Americans are the peculiar chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. God has predestinated, mankind expects great things from our race, and great things we feel in our souls. And let us always remember that with us, almost for the first time in the history of Earth, national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy, for we cannot do a good to America, but we give alms to the world. Now, the mention of philanthropy brings us back to our previous theme and enables us to grasp together a distinctively American nexus, a dream of human fulfillment in what the Truman Report calls more abundant personal lives, achieved through liberal education centering on the humanities. A society united through the common possession of such abundance and private support for the humanistic scholarship that will help us to achieve it. On this last point, Delbanco's book is particularly exemplary. It's delivered by the Julian Clarence Levy Professor in the Humanities, that's his title at Columbia, as the William E. Massey Senior Lectures in the History of American Civilization at Harvard. The talks that comprise this book were underwritten by philanthropy and are in substance and in style entirely consistent with the love of humanity that defines philanthropy. With Delbanco as a distinguished representative of the ethos of the humanities, we can say that the humanities in America are not just supported by philanthropy, nor are they merely brushed by the spirit of philanthropy. They are, in fact, the academic form of philanthropy. Most revealingly, Delbanco has also put a name, melancholy, signifying lack or incompletion, to something that had in other discourses only been obliquely implied. As we've seen, the discourse of the humanities is full of images of enrichment, repletion, and spiritual satisfaction. The humanities are the answer to our prayers, the path to spiritual enrichment, the key to an integrated and fulfilled life. In other words, a deep and persistent sense of longing, a melancholic yearning for a fulfillment that retires before us, haunts the humanities, which have always, in the United States, signified not only a set of academic disciplines, but also a phantasmatic elsewhere, a utopian place where we can be made whole and complete, always in sight, but always receding before us, an America of the Academy. There's reason enough to feel that the humanities have sometimes been poorly served by their advocates, who have promised more than any mere course of study could possibly deliver. Perhaps some might feel we should just dial it down. But if the humanities were to bureaucratize their charisma, if they were to renounce altogether their self-dramatizing addiction to the rhetoric of crisis, if they were to surrender their pretension to wisdom, they might well be trading their birthright for a mess of pottage. They would become drier, smaller, more realistic in their expectation, and therefore less exposed to attack or ridicule, but they would also be sacrificing the questing or exploratory quality that makes people care about them. They would, I fear, become flat and colorless, defined as a mere sector of knowledge like others, and this might encourage the view that their contributions could be measured perhaps by some expert entity such as the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the United Kingdom, which describes its knowledge transfer strategy thus. This is a passage that does not want to be read, so I won't read it. I'll just invite you to feast your eyes on it for a moment or two. Now, it's very hard for an American to read this without laughing. I share your response. It makes Dilbert sound like Toni Morrison. But in the UK, nobody is laughing. Not the Professoriate, and definitely not the Arts and Humanities Research Council. The land of Shakespeare and Handel and Jane Austen and Masterpiece Theater has given custodianship of arts and humanities over to an entity that advises the Technology Strategy Board, which is itself situated bureaucratically within the Department of Business, Innovation, and Skills, BIS. Now, such an arrangement is conceivable there, and inconceivable here, I would suggest, because the humanities, which is the subject of this, are a recent addition to the academic lexicon in the UK. Britain may be unusually rich in terms of the subject matter of the humanities, but the academic category of the humanities is not indigenous. And there's no sense in the UK that the character or the aspirations of the nation are at stake in them. Accordingly, the humanities have no built-in ideological support and no defense rooted in tradition against the vulgar but brutally effective gibberish of the AHRC. Far better, I would suggest, for humanists in this country to accept a utopian unreality, the green light at the end of the dock, as one of the conditions of their work. Indeed, I would go further and say that humanists here would do well, even in this globalizing age, to embrace, with appropriate reservations, the connection between the humanities and the idea, at least, of America. I immediately want to say that these reservations are numerous and substantial. Americans, we should stipulate, do not enjoy privileged access to the fullness of the human condition. They are not, as it happens, the chosen people. The humanities do not secure moral citizenship, nor do they demonstrate the elevation of American goals or the excellence of American conduct. They do not testify to America's world leadership in things of the spirit. They are not really the world's best hope. But the fundamental idea animating the humanities, the idea of promoting human self-understanding, self-realization, and a measure of cultural cohesion on a mass scale, through a program of liberal education with a humanistic core, that is a noble idea, and Americans can take a legitimate pride in having made that idea once upon a time the centerpiece of an American national education policy. It's a policy that has served the United States well because it is integral to American self-understanding in a way that the discourse of the AHRC, which, dehumanized as it is, speaks the language of panic and defeat, is not. The humanities were made in America as an image of American aspirations, and I would submit that we permit the humanities to be marginalized, relegated, or weakened at the cost of those aspirations. The humanities make sense only in a society in which authority is mobile and the rules are changeable. They flourish in flux, the extreme form of which is called crisis. Humanists should understand their work not as a set of professional practices unfortunately afflicted by crisis, but as part of the way that we think of and in crisis. To imagine the social, moral, or political crisis, we might say, is to imagine the humanities. Lucky for us, there seems to be no end of crisis in sight.
Let me thank you for giving us so beautifully clear and thought-provoking an account of a subject that's often treated in the most disappointingly unscholarly fashion, as though the subject of the humanities were somehow off limits for humanistic scholarship. Instead, what you've done is to confront directly the fact that writing about the humanities has for a long time been, quote, immured in a distinctive rhetoric, close quote, that descends more often than not to mere palaver, alternating between the edifying and the vapid. What you give us instead of this palaver is an account of why rhetoric about the humanities is so embarrassingly devoid of substance, a condition which has in many ways enfeebled the humanities in our latter-day contest of the faculties. This point, least of all, needs to be demonstrated, especially after the recent action by the president of SUNY Albany abolishing in one fell swoop no less than 5 humanity departments at his institution. The story that Jeff tells about how a rhetoric of the humanities arose along with humanistic disciplines in America is peculiar to the history of education in this country, another expression perhaps of American exceptionalism, or what we used to call American exceptionalism. As foretold in the prophecy of John Adams, the humanities appears to be a kind of study necessarily deferred until other more urgent kinds of knowledge are acquired. Only then will there be time and leisure for the arts, for their cultivation and enjoyment. This strenuous period of self-denial, I'm tempted to say Puritan self-denial, seems to have stretched out until well into the 20th century, and only to have been abrogated as a result of the fact that proponents of the humanities developed a rhetoric of crisis by means of which they could assert that the humanities were, after all, essential for the formation of citizens, for their full participation in the institutions of democracy, and indeed even for the nation's security. The structure of deferral seems to have brought about the very rhetoric of crisis that would then become the principal rationale for the humanities. And I hope that point is not too truncated. That is, deferring and deferring and deferring the humanities produces all of the energy that goes into the representation of the humanities as in a state of crisis. But it's important to see, as I think Jeff implies throughout his lecture, that this rationale is reactive. The great claims for the humanities in the context of national security evidently compensate for the perception of them as a reward for their own deferral, as nothing less than the luxury purchased by other more necessary and urgent labor. It's this perception of the humanities as a luxury that seems still to govern the distribution of resources in the university. Jeff demonstrates altogether persuasively how the reactive or compensatory rhetoric of the humanities emerged in the wake of World War I, and even more urgently with World War II, which occasioned the formation of the collective that composed the Harvard Red Book, the program of general education that disseminated a widely successful rationale for humanistic study in the post-war years. Curiously, this moment of triumph for the humanities, which was possible because it was linked directly to Cold War anxieties, and which culminated in the formation of the NEH in 1965, seemed to be at once the inception of a new era for the humanities, the moment of arrival at last for the discipline foretold by Adams, and at the same time a high point of their influence. Thereafter, they declined. The very weakness of the rationale, on the one hand, overstating the importance of the humanities in a national security framework, and on the other, retaining the implicitly debunking conception of the humanities as a luxury, doomed the rationale to incoherence. The humanities first suffered a debilitating attack during the 80s and 90s in response to a professoriate that perhaps took too seriously the ideological alliance of humanistic study with the agenda of the state, the program, of course, of all of the Red Book and Red Book-like volumes of the earlier decades. And the humanities were then forced to retreat in more recent years to an inward-looking scholarship that drew sustenance from its professionalist practices, but was increasingly forced to yield up at the same time its meager resources to those disciplines which have more successfully dazzled the eyes of those who control the money. The old rationale for the humanities, the humanistic rationales, have been relegated to the shrinking number of philanthropists, the heirs of John Adams, who still believe charmingly that the enjoyment of culture need no longer be deferred, and that the humanities disciplines are commissioned now to bring that enjoyment to fruition. But that view is not shared with much enthusiasm by the humanist professoriate. Now, it would be hard to quarrel with this grim picture. I believe it's largely and perhaps wholly accurate. In the remaining time that I have, and I don't want to spend too long, because I do think you'll probably have questions, and you should. I'd just like to raise a couple of questions for Jeff, or perhaps for others to answer if they wish. I wonder, first of all, whether or to what extent we are bound to think of the humanities entirely within the framing narrative of American history. Certainly this is the most relevant and constantly pressing context for our reflections, but the humanities arguably have a much longer history, which Jeff acknowledges but passes briefly to return briefly to the prehistory of the humanities. It passes over in the first pages of his paper. Sorry about that. What I'd like to do is to return briefly to that prehistory of the humanities in order to begin to raise my two questions, and I have essentially two questions. Those of us who work in the Renaissance know that the humanities have an origin much older than Adams' conception. That origin is in the Studia Humanitatis emergent in the 15th century. This studia, or what Bacon later simply called human learning, might be understood first as the answer to a question. Human as opposed to what? The answer to this is, of course, divinity, divine learning, or theology. For the medieval and Renaissance schools, the chief or queen of the sciences. It makes an enormous difference to the subsequent development of the disciplines that human learning could include even natural philosophy, or what we would today call science, that belong to the general domain of human learning over against divinity or theology. When human learning began to encroach upon the position of theology, or certain sectors of human learning began to encroach on the premier position of theology in the universities, it became possible to conceive of a total reorganization of learning. Without recounting this complex history, I want rather to ask again the question I just asked, but for us. Humanities as opposed to what? For us, the answer to this question is the sciences, either the natural or the social sciences. It does seem to me that the sciences are relatively absent from Jeff's account of the history of the humanities. They remain a shadowy antagonist that perhaps only goes by the name of utility, a rationale for the sciences, but not a universal rationale. Many sciences share with the humanistic disciplines the aim of producing knowledge, but without any assurance of the utility of this knowledge. It's always been a peculiar and consequential defect of the rationale for the humanities that the humanities have had to define themselves over against the sciences as only a weak form of knowledge by comparison with those other disciplines, or perhaps not a form of knowledge at all. The rationale that Jeff so skillfully sets out for us through its many iterations and reports and commissions invokes a crisis of the humanities, but bemoans the lack not of its status as knowledge, but of its instrumentality in the domains of consumption or in the field of citizenship, that is, private and public domains. It isn't that the humanities possess no importance at all in these domains, but that the exclusive emphasis of this rationale gives up the claim of knowledge to the sciences, a great irony of the humanities' history, because this epistemological demotion brings the humanities into the same field as theology currently occupies, not the field of knowledge, but the field of belief. Against this notion of the humanities, I want to say, without paradox, that the humanities are sciences too. The question upon which I've just touched immediately suggests a second large question, which, for lack of time, will have to suffice for my response, for the remainder of my response. I thought one of the more interesting points of Jeff's paper was his discussion of the peculiar mismatch between the philanthropists and the scholars, a problem that touches on all the deep issues of the paper's contention with the meaning of the humanities, but also on the pragmatic and monetary questions that so bedevil these disciplines today. It's a circumstance worth noting and worrying about that the period of state support for the humanities ended really years ago, to be made up in part by private philanthropy, but only in part. Clearly, the great rationale of the Red Book failed, and the motives of the private philanthropists reverted to the justification prophesied by John Adams, the humanities as luxury, as reward for necessary labor. At the same time, the professoriate decisively rejected the rhetoric of self-cultivation, the private rationale that converges so dangerously on the notion of luxury, in order to reassert the relation of the humanities to the state in other terms, to wit, as the collaborator with the state, and this is something that's been argued in many, many different ways for the last few decades, or as the critic of the state, which is, I think, how predominantly we wish to argue the case today. This rationale has not worked well with the philanthropists, and we can expect that the contributions to our needs are likely ever after to dwindle. But the premise of the mismatch in the rhetoric of philanthropist and scholar is not only a matter of the ultimate significance of the humanities, but also an effect of the difference between teaching and scholarship. And this is my second question for Jeff. It looks to me like the philanthropists are thinking more of the scene of transmission, of the classroom, where the language of love of the amateur is entirely appropriate and strategic, rather than the scene of scholarship, where other standards, those of knowledge production, must prevail. The language of love does not cross easily over into scholarship, though it should animate teaching. I say this without apology, in the hope that at least some of my colleagues will agree with me. There is a difference between the transmission and the production of knowledge, and any rationale for the humanities should reflect upon that difference before attempting to integrate the two venues and their rationales into a single rationale. Perhaps we scholars have been mistaking the rationale for scholarship as the rationale for teaching. If so, we very much need to rectify that mistake without giving in to the temptation to restore a rationale for the humanities that is once again too big, too vague, too easily co-opted to state and other ideological agendas. But at the same time, we also need to think, as we enter the contest of the faculties, about what kind of knowledge the humanities produce, and to see that knowledge as part of human learning, in the most general sense of human learning. The distinction between the sciences and the humanities, about which I would like to hear more from Jeff, this is my second question, has, in my view, served us ill, not because there is no distinction, but because it has been put in the wrong terms, and certainly too severely. When we give up our claims to knowledge, we are inevitably thrown back upon those exaggerated political and cultural rationales Jeff describes so well, and which alternate so unhelpfully between the rhetoric of the humanities in crisis and the rhetoric of the humanities as luxury. Thanks so much.
To both of you for some very suggestive and provocative remarks. Jeff, would you be able to start by responding to some of
Sure. Should
John's
I do
questions?
so from...
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. Well, thanks for that very rich and suggestive response. With respect to the first point, should not we have a more capacious or inclusive frame for thinking about the humanities, not just American history? I'd say, of course we should. Perhaps I could have saved myself some bother by saying how America invented, quote, the humanities, and emphasize that what I was talking about was the academic category of the humanities, not necessarily all the kinds of knowledge that are gathered into the humanities. And I would incidentally not start with the Renaissance. You could start with ancient Greece. You could start with Isocrates, for example, and the rhetorical tradition, which became artis liberalis, and that once Rome fell, Cicero's version of this program emigrated to Constantinople, where it took up residence for the next millennium and preserved the classical learning so that the Renaissance could rediscover it. This is surely an older and just as vital component or tributary to our current understanding of the humanities as the Renaissance contribution as such. But I'd like really to focus on the question of the relationship of the humanities to science. This is really, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, a very, very complicated question. In another chapter of the book from which this essay was drawn, a chapter that was extraordinarily difficult for me to write because I didn't have adequate knowledge when I began it and found myself just kind of lost in the centuries. The story of philology, which at one time was queen of the sciences, taken to be such by Ernest Haeckel, the great biologist, and by Max Muller, comparative religion, and by many, many other people. Philology was thought to be the exemplary science. Haeckel said that if biologists want to understand how to organize a science, you should look to the tree diagrams and classificatory systems of philology. When philology kind of broke down as the end of the 19th century approached, it threw off a number of disciplines, among which were the humanistic disciplines, literary studies, history itself, and classics and other things. So there was a point when what we now call the humanities and what we call science were quite happily conjoined in the dark chrysalis of philology. I don't see any absolute distinction between these two necessarily, but there is a big distinction in the way that they have worked out in the professionalized academy, especially in the research university. I think that the humanities would have been happy to go on an unprofessional or paraprofessional activity, except that When the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes for Health were gathered and began to pump big bucks into the American university system in the 1950s, the humanities, simply in order to breathe the new atmosphere, had to become themselves research enterprises. They could no longer be objects of amateur enthusiasm. They could no longer be amateur practices. Just in order to function in a research university, they had to become research enterprises. And while I wouldn't dispute the claims of the humanities to offer positive knowledge at all, I've dedicated my life to research, and I run an Institute for Advanced Study. I'm not going to say anything bad about research or the knowledge claims of the humanities. I still would like to insist that the relationship of the humanities to the business of research and knowledge is not as easy as the relationship of science to research and knowledge is. This is one reason why we fetishize great teaching of the sort that Richard's described. They don't fetishize great teaching in the sciences. All they fetishize is teaching. They want science taught, but they don't talk about great teachers. But in the humanities, we talk about great teaching because this is where Pache Richards, the electrifying transmission of inspiration, happens. I noticed that when the cuts came down at SUNY Albany and 5 humanities departments were lopped off with a single stroke, the New York Times put together the online version of the Times put together a panel of 5 or 6 people who were asked to comment on this appalling development. Martha Nussbaum, Louis Menand, Linda Carroll, and a couple of others. And if you added up all the books that these people had written, you might well reach 100. I'm not sure, Martha Nussbaum, you might well reach that figure by yourself. In other words, these are people who are committed to research. But how did they defend the humanities? Not a single sentence in a single one of these responses mentioned research. Their backs against the wall, they all fell back on teaching. This is obviously something that is very important to us. It's not reducible to knowledge. It's not reducible to research, as vital as the research component is. So while conceding the point that the humanities have knowledge to offer and that research is a very serious business, I also want to insist that the humanities are not reducible to knowledge. What do you say to that?
I say that I agree entirely. I think that there is a relation between teaching and research that exists for the humanities that is different, as you just said, from the relation between teaching and research in the sciences. What I do think is that we have not developed a particularly good way of talking about that relationship. And that there has been a kind of general mismatch. I think that, as you say, it was because we're not actually disagreeing about this at all. You're just filling in a part with your argument about philology that I was hoping to solicit from you in the comment that I made. But I think that this is an area of research into the humanities or reflection on the humanities that is simply underdeveloped. And the proof of that is just what you said, that we tend to fall back, whereas the question of the public interface of the humanities on a rationale that comes out of the classroom, but that we reserve privately for ourselves another rationale which seems to have no relation to the rationale that comes out of the classroom. So clearly there's just a lot of work to be done to work out the relation between those two rationales in such a way that we don't give up the claim to be practicing a knowledge discipline, and we also don't lose what is very, very particular, very specific, and very valuable in the process of transmission. That is, that we have cultural transmission as one of our objections in teaching, and that is quite a different thing from what happens in science, where one might conceive of teaching bracketing for the moment all the questions about good and bad teaching in the sciences, but where one might conceive of teaching as the transmission of the most recent research. That can never be teaching for us. We transmit artifacts that have supposed knowledge content which we don't credit at all, and yet we transmit those artifacts with the utmost respect and admiration for those artifacts. So that's the situation that we're in. We are surprisingly, in an age of theory, in an age in which fetishizes theory, underdeveloped in the domain of institutional and disciplinary theory.
Would you like to respond?
No, there are so many interesting people in this room that I can't wait to hear what you have to say, but I can't resist making just one response to notes towards a theory of the relationship of pedagogy and research. As the head of a research institute, I hear all the time, especially from younger scholars, concerns that they're just adding an infinitesimal speck onto the very, very tall mountain of research, and who cares about the 5,345th book about Shakespeare? And I've been thinking about that, and I've come up with a defense for the 5,348th and 9th and 50th book on Shakespeare, and it has to do with pedagogy. Considered as knowledge, there might well be a certain redundancy, but of course there is redundancy in any field of research. Every field of research has more research going on than is actually needed to move the field forward, and ours does too. Some of it you could say is trivial, some of it is inconsequential, but of course you can't always know which is which. But the real value, I think, comes in the fact that you have a professoriate that is deeply personally invested in the knowledge that it transmits. In other words, there is a sense that in the classroom that is taught by a researcher, there is a certain value added. And this attitude, this affect of being a participator, being a co-creator of the knowledge that you're passing on, is itself imparted to the student. And the result is that you're not just in retail, you're not merely relaying from here and taking it over there. You're communicating an entire attitude and a stance towards your knowledge. It's an active and participatory stance. I think that this is just as valuable as the knowledge itself.